Okay, here we go.
Okay, you little whippersnapper, what do you want to know?
Who are you? What are you doing here in my garden?
Yeah, I'm Lee Proctor. I'm 73, I think. And my father was Clyde Proctor. And he was the son of Charlie, who was a farmer. And Charlie was the son of Joseph Proctor, who settled in central Michigan. Well, actually, he lived all over the southern part of Michigan and was in the lumber business in his early years and worked for Mr. Blodgett, who was a well-known lumberman at that time. And Joseph, homesteaded a large section of land on the Muskegon River. And as the years progressed and his children, he split the land up and it went to Charlie and his daughter, Aunt Lyda. And there's a couple other sons I don't remember. Some of them went out west and started in the lumber business out in Washington and California. I never got to know them too well. I do remember Uncle Will Proctor, who was Charlie's brother, used to come to Everett at the old farm there where Charlie Proctor lived, and his wife Mary. And he used to come there every summer for 4th of July celebration, and we'd have a big picnic on the farm there, under the trees out in the backyard. Charlie and Mary had this nice home that they built there, probably in the about 1900. And Charlie made maple syrup. He made very good maple syrup, and it was shipped. He got well known, and he shipped syrup all over the country, in New York and California and Seattle and different places in the country to people that he knew. And his farm seemed to be, from what I hear, was always open to a lot of people for entertainment, especially on weekends. And he had people like Edgar Guest there, and I think Kate Smith was there one time. And they knew a lot of people that were well known at that time, and some like Edgar Guest, the poet from the Detroit area. He apparently used to vacation in around Everett in the summertime, so that's apparently how he got acquainted with Grandma and Grandpa. And of course, my father Clyde, he was born there in Everett, or not Everett, but Hersey. Actually, Hersey, or where the farm was halfway between Everett, Michigan and Hersey, Michigan. I think it was 6 miles to Everett from the farm and 5.5 miles to Hersey from the farm. So it was kind of on the borderline there of the two counties, or townships, I should say. And Grandpa had a rough time, producing crops in that sandy, rocky old soil. I remember he grew a lot of potatoes and corn, but he never did obtain a lot of wealth. He was pretty consumed with farming and weather and trees. I remember he wrote a diary, and every day it was about what the temperature was and whether it had rained or not, and how the corn was doing, or how the sap was running, or the temperature and that sort of thing. He was a quiet, hard-working man, and I think he was well-liked. He was good-natured. But I don't know what happened I don't know if anything ever did happen between Grandpa and my father Clyde, but I think Clyde just didn't like farming, and he left home when he was about 15 and went to Alabama. And there was a family friend down there that worked on the railroad, and he trained my father, got him a job and trained him on the railroad there. And he worked his way, right up from driving spikes on the rails to an engineer. And I remember he said that before he got his license as a locomotive engineer, that he had to be able to take the engine completely apart, every part of it, and then reassemble it. So he had to know the machine pretty well. And then when he was like 19 or 20, I think it was 1906, he went to Panama. He got a job on the Canal Zone. And they said that he used to say that he was the youngest locomotive engineer on the Canal Zone at the time, and he was there from, I think, 1906 to about 1913. And I think the First War broke out about the time he left there. There was something about, he kind of had to slip out of Panama because there were a lot of military action apparently around there, and he hopped a steamer and worked his way back to the United States. And then he, I don't know why he never continued on in the railroad business, but he did a lot of construction work, running bulldozers and drag lines and that sort of thing. And then he also worked a lot in meat markets. In fact, he apparently got accustomed to that tropical climate in Panama, and then went to, after a few years back in Michigan, he got married and had 3 little girls, and then he moved to Florida, and he opened up a meat market in Tampa. And he had that for a few years, and then the Depression hit, and he lost it. He just couldn't make a go of it. And then his job, drifted from one thing to another. At one time, he worked in another meat market or general store, and then he worked in the swamps, cutting cypress for railroad ties. He had a crew that he worked with, and then apparently that job petered out, and he got a job as a route man for some baking company. I think it was Dolly Madison or something like that, baking company. And he worked for a feed company in Wauchula. And I was born in 1924 in Tampa, and we lived in Tampa till I was about 4, I think. And then we moved, in the meantime, Mother and Dad had bought a little piece of land up around Bushnell, about 5 acres. And they had, I don't know whether they had a cabin on it or he built it, but there was a cabin there. And then over the years he added on to it. And after he lost the meat market, well, then he went to work for this seed company over in Wauchula. And that's where I started school. And I went there one year, and I was sick a lot with malaria fever, and my sister Nan had malaria too. So then we went back up to Bushnell, and we lived in the weekend or getaway cabin there outside of Bushnell. It was about 2 miles out of Bushnell. And Dad worked in another meat market there for several years. That was a fun place. I started school again there. After leaving Wauchula, I had to drop out in Wauchula because of the malaria. So I had to start over again in Bushnell. And the first school I went to was the Wahoo Swamp School. And Ethel Connell was my teacher. Remember? She would pick me up and was on her way to school. It was a one-house, single building schoolhouse. out in the area of the Wahoo Swamp. And so I went there for a few months and then transferred over to the Bushnell school system. And we had a nice yard there, a big yard, a lot of big oaks, I remember. And in fact, there was one section of oaks that had vines growing all up through the trees, and it formed a kind of an arbor out there, and it was just like a little room. It was always shady in there. And Mother had a little table in there, and she used to write poetry and things like that there. I remember her spending hours out there. And so it was a pleasant time in our life. And there was a Negro church behind us about half, 3/4 of a mile back in the woods. And I don't know if you've ever been to a Negro church, but when they get singing and carrying on, they have so much rhythm, and it just takes over, you know, the rhythm of their music and the singing and everything, and their body motions. Anyway, Dad took us back there one time, and he said that the minister had invited us to come many times, and I don't remember. I remember being there, but I don't remember this saying. But my sister or somebody told us about when we walked in. The minister stopped the music and he said, "I'd like you all to meet Mr. Clyde Proctor. He's been coming to this church for many years, and he finally got here." And then they resumed their singing and carrying on, but that was an interesting place.
What did Grandma do in Bushnell?
She didn't work outside of the house. She just stayed home, wrote poetry, and took care of me, I guess. That was a full-time job, because I used to run away quite a bit. Not exactly run away, but I'd wander off to a couple of miles to somebody else's house and mooch food off of them and things like that, or just visits, you know. But I'd usually get to somebody else's house about mealtime, so I used to wander the cow trails. At that time, Florida had what they call an open range, and there was cattle and wild hogs and running all over the place. Of course, they had fences around the town so that they couldn't get in them, and these cow catchers type things with grates in the road that cattle wouldn't cross because their feet would go between them. But I used to follow those old trails where the cattle would wander through the woods, you know, and I'd go back in there a long time, and I would stay on the trail so I never got lost. But I used to worry the heck out of my mother because she didn't know where I was, and she was afraid I would get lost. And I guess there was a lot of adults that would get lost out there, you know, out hunting and so forth. But I would just stick to the old familiar cow trails, and I didn't have any problem. Remember one time I found this nest of rattlesnakes in a clump of palmettos. And I caught one and stuck it in my pocket and brought it home. How I never got bitten, I don't know, but it really freaked my mother out when she saw that. I showed her that little snake I had in my pocket. I don't know where it was. Just I'm sure it was a baby. I don't think it was a pygmy rattler. I think it was just a baby. But their venom is just as potent as almost as any other snake. You know, rattlesnake anyway.
Didn't Grandma raise guinea pigs and stuff?
Well, that was later years.
Was later.
We stayed in Bushnell until about 1933, and in 1932, my dad got a job around just before Christmas in Michigan. So he left Florida and went to Michigan alone, lived with Grandma and Grandpa. He got a job working on the highway, road construction, and so we stayed in Florida that winter by ourselves, and Dad was up in Michigan. And because he just couldn't get any other work in Florida at that time. And so we stayed on and finished school, and then in about June of 1933, my cousin Helen Proctor got married to Buell Artis, and they came to Florida for a 2 weeks vacation. So on their return trip to go back to Michigan, they swung by Bushnell and they picked us up. It was my mother and my 3 sisters and my dog Laddie, and me in this old car. I can't remember I think it was a Dodge, and we had this old wooden trailer with a wooden tongue, and we loaded all we could get in that darn trailer. And we left a lot of stuff. We just couldn't take it. We walked away, left the property, and stopped payments on it and everything. And in fact, we'd had a car there before, and things were so bad that the guys that Dad bought the car on, on time. And when we couldn't make the payments on it, because Dad's paycheck was late coming to us by about 3 days, and they came and took our car, repossessed it, And Mother was all upset, and I didn't exactly know what was going on, but I knew that those guys were no good, and I ran at them and kicked them in the shins and things like that. But it didn't do much good. They took the car anyway. Well, then, as I say, we went on to Michigan with Helen and Buell Artis. And I remember.
And where did the dog go?
The dog was Laddie. He rode on the running board of the car. The old running boards on the side. It had those fold-up luggage racks on the side, and he would ride on the side of the car and then lean against, put his feet on the front fender and then lean against the hood. He would ride that way for hours. He just loved to do that. And so that's where he rode on the way to Michigan. Until one night we ran into a rainstorm. I think it was up in Kentucky or Tennessee. It was raining like heck, muddy. Apparently the dog got cold or something and tried to turn himself around on the running board, and he fell off. It was at nighttime. So we kept on going because we didn't know she was gone, or he was gone, Laddie. Until we got to this next little town, we looked out and he was gone. And we didn't know what to do. We just stopped and sat there for a minute, And I think we sat there for 10 or 15 minutes trying to decide whether we should turn around and go back and look for him or what, All of a sudden we could see this little white speck bouncing up and down, coming down the road, and here he was following us. So he was all covered with red clay, and he was white. Laddie was a pure white collie, except for one brown spot by his eye back here. It was about that long, just like somebody drew a long eyebrow on him, And then he had a brown spot at the roots of his tail on his behind. And so we had to put him in the car. And here he was, all covered with red clay and sitting on our feet and getting clay all over us. And that's, so I don't remember, but then we stopped at my Uncle Harry's in a little town in Ohio, spent a few days there, and then went on up to Everett. And we stayed there we lived in Grandpa Minchin's, my mother's old homestead there in Everett, Michigan. And at first we couldn't get in the house because it was rented, so we lived in the Everett Review newspaper. Upstairs there was an apartment. So, and my grandfather Minchin was the publisher and editor of the Everett Review, and that was his building, although he was dead at that time. Somebody else had it, but we still had the building, and so we lived there for a year until we could get into the regular old home in Everett. So I went through, I guess it was in the 3rd grade up there, went through to the 10th grade, and then the war broke out, and we moved to, Dad got a job with Handship Manufacturing Company as a chief of plant protection. guard type thing. So we moved to Big Rapids, and I went to school there for a year, and then went in the Navy. And I spent 3 years in the Navy, and was on a destroyer in the Mediterranean. And we were based out of Oran, North Africa. We went on up to Italy and southern France and Malta, and then we were involved. We were one of the lead-in ship in the southern France invasion in 1940. I think it was 45. No, it was 44. And we had our radar jammer on, and we had some French frogmen, and we took them in and let them off, and then they swam ashore and then infiltrated and blew up gun emplacements and stuff, and then we snuck back out. It was a pretty quiet invasion. We didn't really hear any firing until the next day, and we went in at midnight on the 15th of September, I think it was. And so we didn't hear any firing. And then the next few months we spent patrolling this southern France from Marseille, Toulon, up to Monte Carlo and Nice, and then we went up as far as Leghorn, Italy, and we sunk a few ships up there, and we captured what they called a moss boat. It was an explosive little boat that would do about 45 knots, and it had 500 pounds of TNT in the bow of the boat. And the boat wasn't more than like 18 foot long. But it was so fast, at night it looked like a torpedo going through the water, and it had this detonator on the bow of it, and they had a man operating it. And he put it on a collision course, and he'd drop off on a little raft and let the boat go on. If it hit the target, it would explode. But then if it didn't, it would automatically detonate within a few minutes after it missed the target. And then, of course, the fellow that was on the boat would be floating around a little raft out there. So one night when these moss boats came after us, and at first they thought it was a torpedo, and it was coming. It just looked like a white streak across the water. And Lieutenant Vaughn, I'll never forget, he was on the bridge that night, and he grabbed the ship's wheel and turned it. Well, see, the moss boat came in this way, and he turned the boat right toward it, and then went parallel to it, and then the thing missed us. Well, then after it got off our fantail, it blew up, and so then there was another moss boat that had conked out, and the pilot off the first boat apparently swam over to where this other guy saw there was two Germans on this moss boat. And then there was another moss boat, maybe two more, that came after us, and we outmaneuvered them and shot them up with 20 millimeters and blew them up. But then at daybreak the next morning, we came on this one boat with these two Germans, and so we captured them, took the moss boat aboard, and the two German prisoners, and then we took them somewhere in southern France and turned them over to some other division of the...
How old were you when you joined the Navy?
18.
18?
Yeah.
Were you drafted, or did you
Yeah, I was
enlist?
drafted. Actually, I had to get a deferment because I went through my 11th grade, and I had to get a deferment to finish the 11th grade, because I turned 18 in December of 42, and so I had to get a deferment until June of 43 before I could go in the Navy, so I could finish that junior year anyway, because when I was little in Florida with all that malaria and stuff, I missed school quite a bit, and I had to repeat 2 or 3 grades because I missed so much school.
And all that hooky playing.
Well, yeah, that didn't But I used to slip off once in a while. Get sick of school and walk home. Go through the woods. The back way. But that was mainly the reason that I was, so far behind in school.
Well, and describe your parents to me, type of people that they were.
Yeah, my mother, her father's name was George Minchin, and her mother was,
Was it Lorinda?
No,
No.
I can't think of it right now, but anyway.
I thought it was Simmons.
Huh?
I thought it was
her maiden name was Bennett.
Oh, Bennett, that's right.
And George Minchin, they were married, and I don't know, I think they met in Ludington or somewhere.
Right, her parents were from Ludington.
Right, yeah. And I can't think of her name right offhand. That's terrible.
I can't think of it either.
Anyway, George started the newspaper business there in Reed City, actually, and then he moved to Everett when he and his brother, Jess Minchin, started. They were in business together there for years. So they had 7 daughters that lived. And my mother was one of them. She was about in the middle. There was Aunt Hattie and Aunt Foreman, and Aunt Lucy and Jessie and
Nydia and Lydia.
Nydia. Yeah, I was forgot Nydia. She never got married. She was a librarian, and I think she wrote a couple of children's books or something. And the rest of them were teachers, mainly. My Aunt Flormin, who was just a little older than Mother, she was a music teacher in Detroit. My Aunt Lou was a teacher. She was a principal of a school in Lansing. And then there was Aunt Catherine. She didn't go to college. My mother went to Alma. My Aunt Marguerite went to Alma. And I don't think Marguerite ever taught school, but she married a guy by the name of Mel Trevino, and he was a mechanic, and he rebuilt motors. And I don't think she really ever had to work because he made pretty good money. But anyway, Mother was educated and got her teaching degree from, I think she started at Alma and then finished it off at Mount Pleasant, Central Michigan College. And she taught school in various places in the state. And then she knew my dad from the time he was just a young fellow, you know. In fact, all of her sisters knew my dad and his brothers. There was Harry, was one of his brothers, and his oldest brother was Lee, who I was named after. And Uncle Lee was killed in the woods when he was about 21. And they were cutting a tree, and it fell, and it hit the limb of another tree, and that limb bent back and then broke and then boomeranged back the other way and caught him by surprise and hit him right in the base of the neck and broke his neck, killed him instantly. But as I said earlier, Dad did a lot of different types. He was kind of a jack of all trades, really. And although he never liked farming, but he would go back and help Grandpa in his older years. And
Didn't he have a sense of humor?
yeah, he was always joking around.
He looked so stern in his pictures, though.
Yeah, well, I don't have many good pictures of him, really, that do him justice, but he was always, telling jokes and clowning around.
He was a social guy.
Oh, yeah.
Enjoyed meeting people.
He liked to drink, and a lot of women are after his. I remember there was an old maid school teacher that used to live down bottom of the hill from us in Everett. And she taught school in Detroit, and then she would come to Everett for the summer months. And I'll never forget one day, she used to walk by our house frequently. And I was out there one day, she says, "Boy, your father sure is a handsome man." And I think she was kind of hot to trot for him, so to speak. But yeah, he was well liked. Mother, she was well liked. She wasn't a joiner. Dad, he joined a few clubs like the Masons and Lions Club. And
Jessie wasn't a social?
she wasn't she liked social things, but she wasn't what you would call a joiner of clubs.
Mm-hmm.
She liked her private time, I think, to write.
Mm-hmm.
She played the piano a little bit. She must have taken lessons somewhere along the line when she was a kid, you know. Probably her sister Flora Min taught her. I don't know.
And Clyde played an instrument?
Yeah. He played banjo. And Uncle Harry played the violin, and my Uncle Lee played the piano.
And JF had played the violin too?
Yeah, JF. JF would have been my great-grandfather. He played the violin too.
And didn't Charlie and his brothers play some instruments?
I don't recall any of them.
I think I remember reading in JF's paper something about he and the boys would go to a dance or something.
That was my dad.
Yeah. Oh, that was your
Harry
dad.
and Lee, they used to go around and play for dances.
Mm-hmm.
And then my Uncle Lee used to make solo type engagements, you know, at parties and things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they entertained quite a lot. Used to Saturday night dances and that sort of thing, you know.
So when you lived in Everett, you never lived out towards the Everett property or Charlie's farm, or?
No, we lived in Everett in the old Minchin home all the time we were there.
And
although we used to go out to the farm, which was about 6 miles away, frequently. I used to ride my bike out there. And
Charlie and Mary were still there?
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, Grandpa died in, I think it was 1940. He was in his 80s, early 80s, I think, when he died. But I think one time he was on a wagon when he was older and standing on a hay wagon, and the horses lurched forward and unexpectedly, and he fell off the wagon and landed flat on his back on the ground. He fell off the top and injured inside pretty bad, and he never was right after that. And he spent several months in bed, and he finally died.
What was it like as a kid in Everett, out in the countryside, out at the farm?
Oh, we used to go out there a lot. Grandpa would let me go get the horses and ride old Barney. Maybe he had 2 horses, Dan and Barney. Barney was a gray horse that was way back. He was low enough so I could, I could jump and get on his back. Dan was so tall I couldn't even get on near him. Of course, Dan was a little more high-spirited than Barney. So I used to ride Barney in from the pasture. Go out and get the cows, bring them in, walk through the woods with Grandpa. Used to go down to Big Stone Creek there and build dams and chase little crayfish around.
Was there a lot of activity around Charlie and Mary's place?
Yeah, they had, like I said,
Kenny.
What?
Mom.
Like I said, what are they doing up there?
I don't know, but
Rearranging all the furniture, Kenny?
irritating me. They're interrupting my movie debut here.
Where was that?
We were talking about Charlie and the Everett.
Yeah, they used to entertain a lot on weekends and so forth. And we as kids from school, especially during sugar making, our teachers would take us out to the farm, and Grandpa would show them on a field trip, show them through the sugar house, explain to them how he made maple syrup and things like that. And Grandma would take, when the final batch was ready to be taken off, she would pour a little syrup aside and put it on the stove and cook it a little longer. And then it would turn to maple sugar, and then she would pour it in the fresh white snow outside, and then it would get hard. And we'd pick it out of the snow and eat it, oh, it was good. And the problem with it, if you drank the sap, you drank very much of that, it would give you diarrhea.
Oh, really?
Terrible. I learned that the hard way.
Okay.
But I used to, a few times I remember going out and going through the sugar bush with a wagon, horses, and the sap barrels, and gathering the sap.
Mm-hmm.
I remember he had 3 big barrels on the wagon, and it had a big funnel on the top. And we'd go get a bucket of sap and pour it in the thing, in the barrel,
Mm-hmm.
And then after we got through gathering a certain section of the woods, we'd go back to the sugar house, and then we'd put a plug in the barrel, and then put a couple of skids out, and we'd roll the barrels into this little room where they could take them and roll them in toward the vats.
Right.
And then they would strain the sap, because sometimes you get moths and things, bugs in it. Strain the sap before they put it in the evaporators to cook it down. And that was interesting to do. It was always pretty wet, and the ground was starting to break up, because when you're making syrup, they wanted warm days, it would thaw and then freeze at night. For some reason or other, that affected the trees, and the sap ran better. When if it was too cold, it would freeze. But when it would thaw in the daytime, it would start to drip. And so what they had these, like, they drill little holes in the trunk of the tree. They had little spiles, they call it, and they had a hole in them. They were hollow, and they had a little hook on them, and then they drill a hole into the tree, maybe 1.5 inches, and then they tap this little spile in there and hang a bucket on it. And then the sap would drip into that. Some of the bigger trees, not very many of them, but huge old maples, might put 2 buckets on it.
Let's go ahead and stop.
This is the Pigeon River. This is the James and Ida Richmond home that was built about 1927. James and Ida were my grandparents, and they lived here with Uncle Cliff being the oldest, Uncle Royal next, Uncle Joy, Aunt Elizabeth, and my father, Kenneth Bob Richmond. My dad used to tell me stories how he and his brothers would skip stones down in this river, and this river was very deep in those days, and they were not supposed to do it. They had been punished many times, and one time the story was they heard Grandpa coming over the big old wood bridge that used to be here, and so they ran up and hid and left poor Aunt Elizabeth here skipping the stones, and when Grandpa saw her, she's the one that got spanked and punished for doing that. Must have been hard to be the only girl with 4 boys. I'm sure they gave her a run for her money in those days.
This used to be a wooden bridge?
Wooden bridge, big old wooden bridge over this river here.
And how old is this farm?
I'm not sure how long the Richmonds exactly have owned it. This house was built in about 27, but I think there was another house here before it. This house, the lumber and stuff was sent from Saginaw or Bay City, and the person who'd ordered it couldn't pay for it. And I think if I remember right, my dad said that it was built for like $5,000 was the money it took to build this house. When I was a little girl, of course, coming out to the Richmond farm here. In those days, my Aunt Elizabeth wasn't married yet, so she was still here. And Grandpa and Grandma were here. One of my memories is Grandma had big bare or like wood things that pulled out over the countertop, and each would have like 25 pounds of sugar, 25 pounds of flour in that. And I can see my grandmother back there in the kitchen with a big, to me, huge dish pan that she would put flour and sugar, and she would be kneading this, and also there was a pantry about where the 3 windows, where the bay window is now. And that was always real neat for a city girl who didn't have this. So when you came to the Richmond farm, there would be pies and cookies and cakes that would all be in that pantry cooling, and Grandma let you go get whatever you wanted. The back door, there was a sink, and when the men would come in from the fields, I remember there was a wood roller with a big old linen towel that went around that you pulled and dried your hands, washed and dried your hands. In the dining area almost of the house, there was a big brown leather, probably chaise lounge you'd call it today, but couch, and I can remember my grandfather laying on that or resting on that for a half hour after he would eat his dinner. Another exciting thing as a girl were the registers that looked down in the kitchen. So when I would sleep in the bedroom upstairs with my cousin Shirley, you could look through the register and see what all the people were doing in the kitchen, or whispering or telling stories, you know, that they didn't think the kids were listening to. Oh, and you always got to take kittens to bed with you, and that was a big thrill too for a city girl. Let's see, I remember my grandfather being laid out in that front room when he died. I don't remember my grandmother's burial, but I remember my grandfather's. My grandfather was a very staunch, quiet, no nonsense, really didn't like children type of a man, I think. And I remember always being frightened of him.
This is James, right?
Huh?
This is James?
Yes, James. I remember also that he had no patience and couldn't wait. And of course, they always said that most of the Richmonds, that was their problem. They had no patience. Everything had to happen in a hurry. And so with corn machines that they would use in the fields and that, when I remember my grandfather, he had these 2 fingers on this hand, and the rest were gone. And on this hand, he only had a thumb, because of putting his hand when corn shucks would get stuck. Instead of turning the machine off and doing it, he would reach back and lost fingers in this. I can remember my mother saying the other trait the Richmonds had were they were always right. Now, whether this was the Scotch in their blood or not, I don't know, but that they always had to be right, and they would get the Bible and the encyclopedia and everything out just to prove their, whatever it was that they said that's the way it was, they were going to prove that was the way it was. But it was a fun time as a little girl here. Back here where the trees are, there used to be a grindstone that was set up that they used to sharpen knives and stuff with. And I remember that it had pedals like a bike pedal, and that was always fun as a kid. You could go along and you could find a stick, and this grindstone would go around when you pedaled it, and it would go, you know, clickety, 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 clickety. And as a little girl, I can remember that was a fun thing to do. Of course, in those days, they had cattle in the barn, so the men always were milking, so that meant there was lots of milk, there was lots of homemade ice cream. This was a fun place to come as a little girl, and I have many pleasant memories. I have pleasant memories of Christmases when the Richmonds, all of the cousins and aunts and uncles would come here at Christmas. Uncle Joy was always the prankster, and he would usually get the kids into some kind of a mess that the older people would be screaming and jumping at Joy for doing whatever he was doing with the kids. But for the most part, it was fun. One interesting thing at Christmases with all those people. You know, at that time, 40, 50, 60 people would be nothing for Christmas. What do you do with dishes? It would be lots of dishes to do. So one of the wonderful relatives decided that the way to do it and make it something that kids would want to do, would fight to do, would be nobody had to do dishes if they didn't want to. But anybody that didn't do dishes, a hat was passed and this money would be put in the hat. And everybody who did dishes would get to share the money in the hat. So as you can imagine, every kid was fighting to go out there and wash and dry dishes after, these big Christmas dinners that would be held at this house.
What are your earliest memories of being here? How old were you?
Probably when my grandmother was still alive, and she died when I was real young, so, probably, I don't know, like when I said I remembered about the cookies and that, I was probably 3, 4 years old maybe. And often too, my cousin Joyce Richmond, Joyce Lackey, would be here too. And of course she was an older cousin, and she was lots of fun, and that was wonderful to have this older cousin here. So I have pleasant memories of that too. It was a fun place to visit as a child and have nice memories. The other thing I remember as a little girl here was down where those green trees were. That was Dunk and Tilly Campbell that lived there, and they were related to the Richmonds. And I do remember taking a little basket and walking down this road with my Aunt Elizabeth with cookies or jams or something that had been made here at the Richmond farm down to Aunt Tilly Campbell. And across the street where the Weeping Willows are, that was the Dan Quinn farm. Bob and Mary Kay Quinn, Bob would have been Dan Quinn's son, in later years bought Lil and Bob McLean, my aunt and uncle's house in Caseville, but that's where he was raised, and that was another place that Aunt Elizabeth and I would go over to the Dan Quinn house and take stuff or go pick stuff up. So it was, very safe, and kids just could pretty much wander any place they wanted to here. The only scary thing for the adults was, watching out for the river and not getting run over by a cow. But other than that, it was really a neat place with not too many restrictions on what you could do as a child.
Was this a dirt road back in the olden days, so to speak?
I don't remember it ever being dirt. I remember it being, gravel. Yeah, that's what it was, gravel. Because I remember when the cars go by, there'd be lots of dust. But,
and Kurt and Gail Richmond live here now?
yes, Kurt and Gail Richmond, who would be Uncle Joy's son and daughter-in-law, live here at the farm now. It is a nice thought to think that this farm is still in a Richmond's name, and that hopefully one of these days we will have a marker out in this lawn that says Centennial Farm, 100 years in the same family.
And this is off of Limerick Road?
The Limerick Road.
Just outside of Caseville? Okay, great.
You can turn on again in a minute. I thought of something else.
Okay, it's on.
Ida Richmond, who was my grandmother here, was interesting, her life. Her mother and father had, I don't know if they divorced, but they certainly were separated. And her father and mother lived in Saginaw. And when she was a little girl, she was stolen by her father. He stole her, and her grandmother and her mother and grandfather hunted and finally found her, and they stole her back. And so I assume, probably thinking that her father would come after her again, that's when they came up in this area, so that perhaps he would not be able to find them. But to think even back in those days that, you think that, people who steal children is something that's modern day life, but, I had a grandmother who was stolen.
And this was
Ida McGill.
Ida McGill. This happened to her.
Where Kurt and Gail had put in this long, narrow window when I was a little girl, that used to be called the music room, and that was kind of off limits unless you had an adult with you. And in there was a wonderful piano. There was also a organ. And of course, as a child, like doing it with the grindstone out here, it was a pump organ, and you had to pump it with your feet to get the thing to play. The Richmonds were very musical. Grandpa played the violin, Aunt Elizabeth played the piano. I don't know if, I think Uncle Cliff played the piano too. My dad did what he called chorded. He used to have to go with his sister for her piano lessons, but evidently they didn't figure there was enough money for Bob to have piano lessons as well as Elizabeth. So he just had to sit there while Elizabeth had the piano lessons. And so he did learn to, as I said, what he called chord, and he could do pretty well with that. And he played the harmonica once in a while too, or the juice harp, the twangy musical instrument that was very prevalent in those old days. So there was, a lot of music at the Richmond house too.
They would do that in the evening, or parties,
in the
or
evening,
holidays?
It was very hard work on a farm. I mean, I can remember in the years when I was older and Uncle Joy and Aunt Manda were living here at the farm with Grandpa, and I can remember Aunt Manda packing picnic basket type things with sandwiches and fruit and pie and big glass jugs, gallon jugs with lemonade, and getting on a tractor and taking it out to the men in the fields. And this would be late at night, but they were trying to get the crops in before the rains or the cold, whatever it was. And so when they worked, farmers worked very, very hard, and so did the. This is the Caseville, Michigan Cemetery overlooking Saginaw Bay. A place that never frightened me. It's a real homey place to me. I came here as a little girl many, many times. Memorial Day was a especially big day that my grandmothers and aunts would cut spirea and lilacs and tulips, and we'd do baskets, and we'd come out to the cemetery and put them on the graves. So it was always a fun day for me. It was nothing that I was frightened of. Right here in these plots here are William Barber and Catherine Barber and Mabel Barber. Catherine and William were the mother and father of Mabel, who was my dear Aunt Mabel, my great aunt. Her brother is up one more plot here. That's William Barber, and his daughter was Ella Barber Clemens. Next to Will Barber Jr. is Sarah and Bob Richmond, who are my mother and father. And over to the left towards the lake are my grandmother McLean, May McLean, and her husband Neil, and my uncle Robert B. McLean and his wife Lillian. Over to the left is my dear friend June Kretschmer's gravesite, for she and her husband were. He is already buried, and she will be, which is a kind of neat thought to me that she and I have been friends ever since we were little girls in Ferndale, Michigan, probably 12, 13 years of age, and that fate has arranged it so that someday my husband Lee and I expect to be buried up here too, and so we will be friends and neighbors in death as we were in life. For some reason, this comforts me. One of the later memories I have of this that tickles my fancy, my daughter Beth and her family were up here probably in 1993, 94, and there is a place down here where you get water in gallon jugs to come and water your plants. and my granddaughter Sharon was just a little tiny girl, and her Aunt Betty Richmond Mosshart was watering the plants, and Sharon just thought this was really funny, so she went and grabbed a milk jug, and in my mind I can see Sharon running around, and she was watering every plastic plant there was in the cemetery. She was helping Aunt Betty. When we leave this spot in the cemetery, Clay and I are going over to the Richmond plot, which would be my father's family that are also buried here. So many family members on both sides are buried here. The Queenie and Hazel Reeves are at the back of this plot. Queenie and Hazel were dear, dear friends of my Aunt Mabel and my grandmother May McLean. They played bridge together. They were wonderful, wonderful friends for as long as I can remember anybody in Caseville. I can remember the Reeves girls. I also remember the Kerns. There's Bert and Sadie Kern. And Sadie Kern was a postmaster in Caseville for probably 25 years or more. And she was another dear friend of Aunt Mabel and Grandma, and probably played bridge with her every week of her life for 40 years. So there are a lot of old friends that are here interned also. This is also one of the Richmond plots. This would be Elizabeth Richmond Grassman and her husband Wallace. Elizabeth would have been my father's sister. She would be the sister who skipped the stones out at the Pigeon River Richmond farm that I told you about earlier. This would be her son Jim Richmond, who was named after his grandpa James Richmond. Jim died as a very young man, and was a nice guy. Her son Tim also died at a very young age. Tim, I believe, is probably buried in Cass City Cemetery because that is where he lived. But Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle Wallace are here in the Caseville Cemetery also.
Okay.
This is the plot of Vern and June Kretschmer. Vern was a Pigeon native all of his life. June was my dear friend
Yes.
who I grew up with in Ferndale, Michigan. Her name was June Wenz, W-E-N-Z, Kretschmer. And after I moved back to Caseville in 55, 56, June came up to visit me and met Vern and married him and has lived here most of her life.
Okay.
This is Bob and Lillian McLean's plot. Bob McLean was my mother, Sarah Richmond's half-brother, and his wife Lillian. There was another brother, William Hector McLean, W.H., but he was cremated and his ashes scattered in Florida. This is May McLean, who would have been Mabel McCoy, Mabel Barber McCoy's sister, and her husband Neil McLean. When my mother, Sarah Sadler's father drowned and May McLean came back to Caseville, when mother was 6 or 7 years old, she married Neil McLean. And as mother always said, even though he did not adopt her, he always treated her like she was his daughter. And she was very fond of him. He was the undertaker in Caseville, and furniture store he owned. He was one of the... This is The Richmond plot, James A. and Ida McGill Richmond. These were my father's mother and father. They are the ones that owned the white farmhouse out on the Limerick Road. As can be seen from the headstone, Ida died in 1940 and I would have only been 5 years old, so I don't have many memories of her. And James died in 50, so I was 15 then, so I do remember him. They had another child, which I believe is this small headstone here, that died, I believe, before my father was born. And the Richmond plot is just up from the Steinman Wagner plot, and behind me is the Johnson. So this is the part of the cemetery where Ida and James are buried.
And somehow this guy's related.
Grandpa Shoebaugh was related somehow to the Richmonds. In fact, I think that he married maybe one of the widows, Richmond widows, because I remember my father talking about Grandpa Joe Shoebaugh. And I believe when my Uncle Cliff first started farming that he farmed the Joe Shoebaugh farm, and I believe it was left to him when Joe Shoebaugh died, but I don't really remember without talking to somebody. This is the Neil and May McLean house. Neil and May McLean were my grandparents. My mother was raised here, Sarah Richmond, as well as her brothers, W.H., Dub, and Bob McLean. Their father died when they were quite young, 8, 9 years old, and my grandmother's sister, Mabel McCoy, came to live with them. And so the 2 women and the 3 children lived here for many, many years. At that time, M25 was not even built. And so I suppose because of having 3 children and no Social Security in those days, the women had to think of something they were going to do to earn some money to take care of everybody. Mabel had been had a millinery shop in New York City and had come home when May's husband got ill and intended to go back to New York to live, but never did. She spent the rest of her life here in Caseville and is subsequently buried out here in the Caseville Cemetery. M25 in the 1925, I suppose, 27 years, was going to be built, and the women could see the potential with the men who came up here, the contractors. Of course, there being no restaurants at that time, so they started taking in boarders here in this big white house, which had 4 bedrooms upstairs and 2 bedrooms downstairs, plus a big sleeping porch at the back of the house. And in those days, board and room usually went together, so they started serving meals too. They were both very good cooks. May was probably a better cook than Mabel, and not only did they serve to the workers on M25, but they started serving Sunday chicken dinners. My mother talks not fondly about this time, that it was nothing but lots of work and lots of dishes to be done. But many other nieces and nephews in the family thought it was great fun to come to McLean and McCoy's lodge and help out for the Sunday dinners. About this time, Mabel decided that she would start building some cabins because it seemed like more and more men were coming up from the city to fish. Saginaw Bay had lots of perch at that time, and there were not places to stay. So Mabel at first built little cabins across the street. She had them, most of them were named. The little small one there at the back is called the Long Window Box Cabin. There was one that was called the 2-bedroom cabin, because it was the only one that had 2 bedrooms. And she started to rent these to fishermen. The years went by, and Bob McLean was really a very good businessman. He was an entrepreneur, and he started to help his aunt in these. He put in, next to the McLean house, a little hot dog hamburger stand. That went so well that he added on to it, and he built a little store on the corner. He put 4 cabins in the backyard behind the store, and between he and Aunt Mabel, they had probably 12 cabins to rent, besides what could be put into the McLean house. This was a very lucrative business for a number of years. I can remember going with Aunt Mabel to make up beds and cabins for people that were coming for the weekend or for the week. McLean and McCoy Lodge was known, you know, in many, many areas.
And it all started about when? What year?
I would imagine 28, 30 maybe, in that area sometime. So as time went on, this became, when I was older, a place to come. My mother was not well, she was ill, and so I would come up here and stay. The panoramic view across the street is the Caseville County Park, and I remember many times being taken over there, because it was still there when I was there when I was a little girl, and Aunt Mabel would swing me on the swings, and she would take me to get an ice cream cone. They used to sell ice cream down there in the little park store. And I was telling my son Clay, who was doing this filming, that I remember one time Aunt Mabel took me over there, and I went up the slide backwards, fell off, broke my arm, and she had to carry me across the road and up the hill, and Uncle Bob had to drive to Detroit with me because they had to set my arm. I had broke it so bad. May McLean became a recluse for probably the last 20 years of her life or more, and lived in this house, loved people to come and visit, but never went out of the house again. She probably, at her death, it had been over 20 years since she had ever seen downtown Caseville. Lil and Bob, when they married, they eventually built the big brick store down at the corner, and then in the years after the war, World War II, they sold the store and built the big brick house that's next to the McLean house. My own parents, Bob and Sarah Richmond, after Aunt Mabel died, lived in what we called Aunt Mabel's cottage, which was the big cottage across the street with the red brick fireplace. Uncle Dub had helped build that. He was a builder, and he built many.
It's Percy Township in Osceola County in Michigan. I am here visiting my family property that has been in the family for many years. My great-great-grandparents on down have lived here at one point or another. My great-great-grandfather homesteaded about 600 acres in this area, and the various family members ended up, getting a variety of different sized properties. What is left of all this property is 1.4 acres of land that's on the creek known as Big Stone Creek, and Kenny and I have come up this week to work on clearing out some of the land and getting it ready to camp on. We're going to be walking around some and taking a look at the property and what we've done, and we'll continue on in just a minute. We'll go ahead and take a look around and get a perspective of the area around the property. That's George Compton's property there with the new house going in. He passed away recently. And this is Grandma Proctor's property, Clyde and Jesse Proctor's property over here where the cabin's located. This is 125th Street, used to be known as Proctor Road. Go ahead and cut. The road where it crosses the Big Stone Creek. This creek is a spring-fed creek that empties out into the Muskegon River. It is also a creek that has a little creek that feeds into it called Proctor Creek, which apparently was named after the Proctor family. It has trout, crayfish, frogs, turtles, quite a variety of aquatic and wildlife that exists here. It's an extremely clean creek with just a tremendous amount of vegetation and wildlife that lives here. Problems with erosion are occurring along one side of the creek. So I thought if we changed the path, people would go a different way and we could slow down the erosion. We are on Big Stone Creek. Over here to the right is where my dad, Lee Proctor, lived when he came after World War II. When he came home, he lived in a trailer on his property, and his old electric box is still up here from that time. Of course, he had to clear trees at that time, and since then, all these trees that exist here now have grown up considerably. We're going to go ahead and take a look up at the ridge in just a minute. Can you catch this frog, Kenny?
I'll try.
Frogs, I don't know how many there are that live on this creek here, but they're quite plentiful and tend to jump off the banks as you walk along.
Come on, master. Good time here. Oh, there's Clay's feet.
Just focus on the crayfish.
I already saw the crayfish.
Huh?
I already saw the crayfish.
With the camera?
Yeah.
Oh. You filming still?
Yeah.
I thought we said we were going up to the fish.
Oh, let me go back a little bit.
Stayed out here till about 11:30 at night. Had a grand old time until we heard a death cry of some type. It sounded like an animal had killed another animal. So that was rather unsettling, but other than that, we had a great time out here last night.
this is the ridge of the property. It goes from the wetland and the creek, comes to this ridge, and then shoots up. It's a gradual incline that continues to get probably 50, 60, I don't know, even maybe 80 feet from the top of the ridge to the bottom of the wetland area. It's a pretty steep climb going up there, and we're going to go up there right now. Looking forward, I'll be back next year.
Okay.
Did you cut? Okay, this is the south direction of the pathway, I guess, the drive. And you can see down the road here. And to the left is Jesse and Clyde's cabin. And the farm is right up here that Kelly Robinson recently, well actually 10 years ago, sold to him and Linda, who we met yesterday. He and another Detroit cop bought the property out here, about 60 acres. And he took us down to Proctor Creek and what they call the swimming hole back there yesterday. Gave us some squash and potatoes fresh out of the garden, which was kind of exciting. And off at an angle up through the woods. We have 2 survey stakes out at the front here. Okay, Kenny was just panning down to the 1.4 acre piece of property that we still own. Now we're looking at Charlie and Mary Proctor's farmhouse. Charlie and Mary were my great-grandparents, and this is a farmhouse that they had built and had worked on for many, many years and lived here and are buried here actually over to the left of the house. Ed Hurst has recently renovated the outside of the house, and it looks fantastic. It looks better than it probably ever has. And we're going to take a look at the barn and the smokehouse and the grave sites in just a minute. Just prior to the outbreak of World War I, they smoked a variety of different meats inside that smokehouse, bringing up stone from the creek or from the fields. Behind it is the old barn that still exists and was built back in the late 1800s and has the diamond window, which are seen in old photographs that we have of the Proctors and the Minchins. And the diamond window is also within the old farmhouse up at the top of the gable. Mary Proctor is also the gravesites of Vera and Henry Klein. Vera was Charlie's sister. Actually, Vera was Charlie's daughter, and she's buried here as well. This is the something else that the German fellow supposedly made. According to the stories, he took the river rock and created a variety of planters. I found those planters, 2 of them out in a cemetery 30-40 miles away at grave sites of some of the Proctors. I'm not sure whose stone this is for, if it's for someone in particular, or if it is just a general stone denoting the Proctor cemetery. Up here we have the grave sites of Vera Proctor Klein and Henry Klein. Vera was born in 1890 and died in 1958, and Henry was born in 1886 and died in 1959. They are Kelly Robinson's parents. And then over here we have the graves of Charlie and Mary Proctor. Charlie was born in January 5th of 1860 and died in April 10th, 1940. Mary was born September 21st, 1865, and she died February 1st in 1946. Joseph Fernando Proctor was Charlie's father, and he lived just up the road here. His family came from, his grandfather came from Manchester, England, and his grandmother came from Dublin, Ireland. Daniel Proctor was a craftsman who had tried a number of times to come over to the New World, or to the colonies, I guess it was at the time. And he tried a number of times to come over and had problems because they weren't allowing craftsmen to enter the country with tools and a variety of stipulations. And so he finally made it after about the third try. There's a tremendous amount of history out here, and you know, there's a lot more to explore and discover, and it's been a fun trip, and looking forward to coming back here next year. You look tasty, mister.
Shoot, I lost him.
Oh, that water is so cold.
I saw a frog and I took his picture and I lost him. He blended in. Oh well. The focus is weird. Wait a minute.
Your
I
friend
can't
here?
focus on him. I can't focus on him.
How's that?
Wait a minute. I don't know what the problem is.
Quite green. All because you've been messing with the focus.
He's cute. Look at him. Look at that paw. He says, what are you doing to me?
Should we let him go?
I think you better.
Okay, watch him in the water.
Either that or eat him.
Watch. You got him?
Yeah. Oops, better back out. There he goes. Oop, into the dam. I can't focus.
Hiding out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Guess I can't see him now. Oh, there he is. Until jump. There's your frog. In the water. You want to make him jump, Clay? No, I'll let him be. Unless you guys want to see him jump. That's it. Where is he? Wait, I lost him. Hold on. Oh, there he is. Wait, I lost him. Wait, I lost him. Is that him? Or is that a leaf? Wait a minute. Oh, I lost the frog. Oh, there he is.
See him?
Yeah. Yep.
Here comes that. Oh, there's another one. Alright, that's enough.
Alright.
This was rather sad to see. I have been coming up here the last few years and have seen this property a number of times, took a number of pictures, and apparently in the last year some vandals or someone has burned the old place down. Although it was probably beyond repair, it was still kind of fun to come up here and be able to see it. This is the old windmill that would, I guess, bring water up from the well beneath it, and these are the lilac trees, one of which I dug up and took back to Maryland with me. Let's go ahead and go take a look at the barn. Come on down. I'm pretty sure either Harry or JF had this built, and the wall is phenomenal. It's an incredible wall with gorgeous stone.
Kind of creepy.
This is where the buzzard came out of the barn and promptly vomited up its roadkill to scare me off.
Lovely. Can we look inside? I hope it adjusts. You can't really see anything. It's gonna be too dark. Oh, some stone. A ghost. A skeleton!
This is the old outhouse with 2 adult-sized holes and one little kitty hole. So I guess this is the family that
Clay.
something together. I think it was pretty cold in the wintertime.
There you go.
So if you had to go out and go to the bathroom through the snow, a lot of times I think people go together to help keep warm.
Ew.
Because as you can imagine, snow drifts and you know, ice and snow, you know, 3-4 feet deep, that could be pretty nippy. One of these trees has a midfoot.
What? You see him? Oh yeah.
Now, here's HP up here, and my dad
Don't
thinks
encourage
that
kids.
was maybe Harry Proctor that did that,
Oh my goodness.
because he apparently lived here.
Now, nobody, any kids watching this know better than to carve into trees, right?
That's right.
Don't do this.
Come look inside the barn over here.
Alright. Unless maybe.
This is turn of the century farm equipment, probably that Harry, Charlie, maybe JF had used at one point in time. It's quite old, and who knows how much longer it'll be here. But it was typically pulled by you know, horses or cows, but I would tend to think it was probably horses that pulled the equipment.
And this is the barn also that's on the old JF property.
Foundation to the basement. There's rock.